counseling for HS2 Academy. So tonight's seminar, I think might seem a little bit strange now that it's still only January and we're still in winter for some parts of the country. But I want to talk to you about maximizing your summer for college success. And the reason why we're starting off this early is that most of the activities that are most competitive, the most selective ones, actually will have deadlines just right around the corner, right? So I think it's very timely that we already start our planning even this early, like 5 or 6 months in advance, just so you can set yourself up in a position to be much more successful for college applications, right? So while it might seem strange talking about like summer this early, right? It makes a lot of sense if you're planning right, if you're looking far ahead to see like what you can do to make yourself more competitive. All right. So first of all, I want to ask, like, how is that summer best used? For most schools, you'll probably have a good like 9 or 10 weeks in order to position yourself to be much more competitive, right? To get a head start or to get a jump on your competition, if you will. Okay. So let me ask you, so how should you spend your summer, especially if we have any students in the audience today? Should you hole up in your room and play video games all summer, Call of Duty, Fortnite, or whatever is your interest, right? So is that the way you should do it? Okay, you probably already know the answer, right? Or should you start binge watching some of the shows that you've been wanting to catch up on, right? Some people really love to sort of just jump into those rabbit holes and watch like Netflix or, you know, whatever shows that you've been meaning to watch, okay? Or should you just be on social media with your friends, glued to your phone, be on TikTok every single hour of the week? Or none of the above? Well, if your goal is to get into one of the best universities in the country, I'm going to say none of the above, right? None of those are bad individually, but if you do it in moderation and you still have a larger goal for the summer, then I think it's okay, right? You don't necessarily have to say like, oh no, I can't play video games or I can't talk to my friends. I'm not advocating that. But I do want you to have higher expectations for yourselves in terms of what you can do during the summer, okay? All right, part of the reason for this is that things are only getting harder every single year, okay? So first of all, we want to take a look. So these are the most recent college rankings based on US News and World Report. So as you can see, a lot of these names are familiar, right? So many of these schools here are going to be part of the Ivy League, right? In fact, I think all but... Okay, hold on. I think all but Cornell. Actually, no, Columbia is also not here this year. Okay, so all the schools on this list, 6 out of the 8 Ivies are represented here as well. Okay, so as you can well imagine, these are the big name brand schools. These are the schools that everybody thinks about when you're thinking of like the most competitive, the most rigorous academic environments in the country. Okay, but another category of colleges that I think you should also explore are the liberal arts colleges. Right, so these are smaller colleges typically, and the main criteria that distinguishes a liberal arts college from a national university is that a liberal arts college simply doesn't have grad school. Okay, you don't want to mistakenly assume that a liberal arts college is only a place where you can only take liberal arts majors, right? Which is what some people think of when you think of like humanities or social sciences, right? So in fact, many of these schools are actually incredibly strong for fields like, you know, like bio, if you want to go pre-med. Places like Amherst and Pomona are some of the strongest places to study pre-med. A school like Swarthmore, for instance, also has engineering and computer science. In fact, there are some liberal arts colleges that are devoted to preparing students just for engineering. Case in point, there are schools like Harvey Mudd out in California or Olin in Massachusetts that are dedicated to preparing students just for computer science and engineering, okay? So you don't want to mistakenly assume that a liberal arts college wouldn't be a good fit for you just because you're not interested in whatever major you think they're going to cover there. So in fact, liberal arts colleges do have some advantages over the larger research universities in the sense that the professors are only there just to educate undergrads. So you can form much closer relationships with your professors. If they do offer research opportunities, it's catered just to undergrads, right? Now, on the flip side, if what you want to pursue career-wise is much more research-oriented, then of course it makes more sense for you to look more closely into these big national universities, okay? So the national universities in that left column are also called research universities for a reason, okay? These big universities will also have maybe a broader array of majors. That's another advantage that you can think of too. So if what you want to study doesn't neatly fit in a box of like a traditional major like biology or electrical engineering, or say, for example, political science, then you're going to have a better chance of studying things that are maybe like an interdisciplinary overlap of two fields if you went to a larger university, because there would be more courses, there would be more departments and more faculty to teach a wider array of classes. Okay. Now, if you live in California, one other really good sort of advantage that you have out there is that 6 out of the top like 15 or so, top public universities are actually in California, right? So as you can see here, like schools like UC Berkeley, UCLA, even schools like UC San Diego and UC Davis are all part of the top 40 as far as US News rankings are. And this is not just for public universities, these are for all universities. Okay, so public universities are often excellent choices as well, especially for fields where they excel in the most. So I would say schools like Berkeley are going to be outstanding for fields like engineering or business, right? I mean, they're still pretty good overall, but for those fields, they're probably just as competitive in many regards to the Ivies, right? So it's definitely one thing that you want to consider. If you happen to live in a state, for instance, with excellent public universities, that should be part of your strategy to also apply to those schools. And if you want to aim for maybe even more selective schools, that makes sense for you to also try for that. Okay. Also, did you know that there are actually over 5,000 universities and colleges across the United States? So yes, it might seem like these colleges are really hard, but it's only because people want to apply to the same colleges, right? So we have our set sort of like, these are the name brands, if you will, for universities. So everybody applies to these same schools, okay? But if you're willing to look at other options, you might actually find some good value schools in terms of schools that are still pretty strong for your major, even if they're not necessarily the most recognizable, if you value like the overall strength of your undergraduate education a little bit more than say the ranking, right? So of course you want the best of both worlds. You want a school that's very well known, but you also want to make sure that your backups are also incredibly strong for your said major, okay? So what does all this have to do with summer, basically? Well, I mean, as these colleges get more and more competitive, it's important for you to realize that like you need to up your game, right? You need to find ways to distinguish yourself from your peers. And unfortunately, during the school year, there's only so much you can do because most students will have the same classes. You're going to have access to the same clubs and activities. So summer is usually that optimal time when you can do things to make yourself stand out even more, right? To do even more than like what your classmates are doing. So as you can see, this is still from last year's, of course, like we don't know the regular decision results just yet, but if you take a look at last year's acceptance results for the Ivies, things are only getting harder, right? So of course, things dropped down precipitously like a couple of years ago, and that's in large part because of the pandemic. As colleges gradually waived their requirement to have the SAT or ACT as part of their admissions requirements, more students decided to apply to them, which is why you see these massive drops in most of these colleges in terms of the acceptance rate, because all of a sudden, like a lot more people feel like they have a shot at Harvard because they didn't have to submit an SAT, okay? So things are only going to continue to get harder, okay? But hopefully it's kind of stabilizing a bit, so it's not just going to be as big a drop as like 2 or 3 years ago, okay? These, in fact, are the most recent early action and early decision acceptance rates. And so in a way, there's kind of good news because they're not quite as low as those rates that we just saw for the regular decision rates, okay? But even then, many of these schools, it's actually decreasing. I mean, there's some outliers. There's some where it actually increased a little bit. But I think for the most part, like the acceptance rates for these early schools are even getting harder and harder. In fact, we just found out today that USC, which is a school that just added early action this past year, only accepted 5.9% of their early action applicants, right? Which is kind of ridiculous, but they also had a huge number of people apply, right? I think they received almost 40 or actually over 40,000 applicants for their early action, right? So of course, it's going to be very, fiercely competitive, right? So, and I guess that's kind of what USC wanted, right? They wanted to really get more applicants in the pool so that they can look more competitive, right? So if that was their intent all along, mission accomplished. Okay, so what does all this have to do with the summer? Well, we want to position yourself to be much stronger. So if your goal, if your aspiration in high school is to get into a top university, like a top 20 or top 25 university, then you really need to understand what it is they're looking for, right? So these schools, as you saw earlier, have they'll only accept 1 in 20, 1 in 25. So it's critical to really set yourself apart, to distinguish yourself as much as you can, to show that you're unique, that you're showing advanced skill sets for whatever it is that you're choosing as your major, to show more passion for learning, basically, right? So these are all things that you can accomplish if you plan your summers well. Okay, so if you were to look at the criteria that colleges typically take a look at, so these are taken from an institution called NACAC, which is the governing body of all the admissions officers and all the high school guidance counselors in the country, right? And so when they do these yearly surveys, they had that their members rate which factors are the most important. And not surprisingly, of course, your grades are the most important, right? Like how hard are the classes that you're taking? What's your actual GPA in those classes? So the strength of your curriculum does matter as well. Okay, so for institutions where you have to submit testing, then of course, SAT or ACT is pretty important, but like there are also schools like the UCs, like Caltech, that are effectively what are called test blind schools right now, where they don't even look at the SAT or ACT and they tell you not to even submit it. Okay, so in those schools, you could just sort of like rule out or just kind of like just draw a line through that factor, right? So testing is not going to be used against you if you're not able to or choose not to submit it. Okay, but other than that, everything else follows suit. So obviously your essay is going to be important. Your recommendation letters are also pretty important. And then here's an interesting thing. The extracurricular activities might seem kind of low, but you have to consider the fact that, hey, if you're applying to some top schools, most, if not all, of the candidates for those schools are going to have pretty competitive GPAs. They're going to submit good test scores. And of course, they're going to get great recommendation letters. So even though, relatively speaking, these things look like they're lower in the rankings, things like your talents and extracurriculars become even more important the closer people get, right? So the more you have like top-notch candidates, this is really the one factor where you can set yourself apart, because let's face it, at the end of the day, how do you outdo someone with a 4.0 unweighted GPA? Or so like, the best you can do is match them. Hopefully you have some impressive extracurriculars and hopefully you get some great recommendations as well, okay? All right, so what can you do in order to prioritize your summer? So I normally suggest that you focus on 4 main sort of criteria to determine how to best use your summer. Okay, the first is your academic record. Okay, because it doesn't make much sense logically for you to apply to all these like internships or competitive summer programs if you're already struggling to maintain a good GPA with your school right now, right? So it would make more sense for you to go ahead and either use the summer to prepare for the upcoming school year, or perhaps take some extra classes to sort of bolster your GPA. And we'll talk a little bit about that in terms of what you can do. If you are planning to apply to some schools that do require the SAT, and I'll talk about a couple of those later on, or you're just looking at the test to maybe like bolster or compensate for a GPA that's not higher, then of course, summer is one of the best times for you to prepare for the SAT or the ACT, okay? One thing about this upcoming summer is that like for many of you, one test format that's going to be newly introduced in the spring of next year, not this current spring, is the digital SAT, right? So which means if you're planning to take the SAT, it actually makes a lot of sense for you to use the summer to prepare for it, because there are a lot of unknowns, right? So many people don't know what to expect with that new test. Yes, there are a handful of diagnostic tests that College Board just released like a couple months back, but people will develop tricks and strategies in terms of how to do better on the SAT. So if that is something that you want to use to sort of like set yourself apart even more, then you should really consider preparing for SAT this summer, okay? So some of you may also need to build evidence for your major, okay? And what we mean by this is that if you're applying to more competitive majors like business, computer science, or engineering, it's not going to be enough that you get good grades in, let's say, math and science classes. You want to show that you're participating in activities that are building your skill sets and showing that you're actually very passionate about those fields. And so obviously, like the summer is a great time for you to be able to kind of like build up a core list of activities, right? So be it a summer program or an internship, or even just taking some extra coursework to show that you're interested in these fields is going to be really important for the summer. And then lastly, the summer can be useful to, make yourself look more well-rounded, to pursue activities that maybe make you look less stereotypical, right? So let's say, for example, you're looking to do computer science or engineering, but all your activities are so stereotypical, kind of like STEM, right? So summer can actually be a good time to sort of vary up or change up what you do in your profile, right? So that could be another good use of the summer as well. So let's take a look at each of these in more detail now, okay? So priority number one is strengthening your academic record, right? So if your grades aren't all that strong, it makes a lot of sense for you to use the summer in order to boost up your profile, okay? So many people weren't aware of this, but you can actually make up certain bad grades by taking summer school, right? And it can even be through like an online high school. I mean, this is essential, absolutely necessary. If let's say, for example, you got a D or an F in a class, right? But even if you got like a C, you can still take more courses outside in order to sort of balance out that bad grade, okay? So there are a couple of institutions that we've normally recommended in the past. There are places like the National University Virtual High School. There's a place called Apex Learning, where you can take courses to go ahead and boost up your profile, okay? So regardless of whether or not your school will accept these credits, you could still send a transcript directly from one of these institutions. But I think it's also best that you first ask your school counselor whether or not these courses will carry over or transfer over to your transcript, okay? You can also boost up your overall profile by taking college level courses, right? This can be as simple as like taking local community college classes. But if you wanted to take things that are more rigorous, you could take things from actual universities, like four-year universities. Like every single year, HS2 had partners with UC Riverside to offer exclusive courses just for our students. Now, if your family can afford it, or you just want to actually go visit these colleges, most of the top colleges will actually have something called like pre-college programs, where you can take an undergraduate level course at like a Stanford or a Harvard or a Columbia, right? Now, of course, they're going to be charging their normal tuition rates, right? So it's kind of common for you to spend maybe something like $5,000 or $6,000 per course if you're taking it at those institutions, because that's like their normal per unit rate, okay? So, like it depends on what your goals are, but that's certainly a factor to consider as well if you're thinking of taking extra coursework during the summers, okay? One other thing you can do if your GPA isn't necessarily the best is you can always use the summer to prepare for your upcoming classes. This would be especially necessary if you're thinking of taking much more difficult classes like honors or AP classes the following year, right? So I would especially say like if you're a current sophomore and you're planning to take something like AP biology or AP US history during the summer, it's almost essential, right? It's almost mandatory that you spend some of your summer going ahead and previewing for the material you're going to cover during the school year, okay? So what if your grades are already great? You're already an A student. What can you do in the summer to help out with that? Well, the thing I mentioned earlier, you could still take additional courses, right? You can take college level courses because every college level class you take is essentially calculated the same as adding extra AP level semesters into your GPA, okay? So in theory, if you're already a straight A student, but you didn't maybe have as many weighted classes for 9th grade or 10th grade, if you were to take, let's say, a college level class, that would count the same weight as like an AP level class. It would be counted as a 5.0 GPA if your high school operates on a 4.0 GPA, okay? You should also try to preview for your most difficult classes, right? So over the years, like I've met some students who've challenged themselves by taking something like 4, 5, or even sometimes 6 AP classes, okay, the following school year. So and that's going to be really difficult to do if you're not spending part of your summer to prepare for that, right? So we normally tell students, go ahead and order your school textbook for those classes even before the summer. So that way you can craft a plan for you to go ahead and study that material so that way, when the school year starts, you're ahead of everybody else, right? You've already looked into the material. You're maybe like, a good month or two into the content before everybody else. And that'll make it much easier for you to be able to get great grades, right? So that's typically the secret that many students have that allows them to take so many AP or IB classes, is that they really spend the time well ahead of time to prepare for those classes, okay? All right, so how can HS2 help you, right? So every single year, HS2 offers preview courses for the whole range of AP classes. For some more challenging honors classes, we do as well. Like every single year, we help with like honors pre-calculus, for instance, right? Because we know in many of the high schools that we serve, these are classes that like can sometimes be very challenging for students. So we want to make sure that students are prepared for these things as well, okay? We also give students access to college level courses. Like I said earlier, we have a partnership with UC Riverside to offer college level classes just for HS2 students. The great thing about that is that if you want to take a college class, but you're a little intimidated by taking a college class with college undergrads, I think it's nicer to be in the same pace with students that you know are all at your level. Okay. And then lastly, our counselors use the summer to help make strategic plans with students, right? Recommend the ideal course schedule, recommend what kinds of things that they can do during the summer to prepare. Oftentimes, too, our counselors are very familiar with a lot of the local high schools. So if we have certain resources that we got from previous students in terms of things that we know that those students will cover during the school year, we can tell students, oh, okay, during the fall, there are these projects that your teacher will typically give, so you can actually already start to prepare for it during the summer, okay? Okay, so priority number 2 is standardized testing. Now, these days, standardized testing has taken a little bit of a backseat. It's not quite as important as it used to be these days. However, especially if your grades are not perfect, if you're not a 4.0 student, testing can still be a great way for you to sort of compensate somewhat for a less than perfect GPA, okay? Now, even if you do have a perfect GPA, it does make you stand out even more if you have like straight 4.0 unweighted. If you can get a really solid score in the SAT or ACT, it will typically be better for you for even the top colleges across the country, okay? All right, so also many colleges these days are incrementally adding the SAT requirement again, okay? So as of last year, colleges like Georgetown, MIT, Georgia Tech have gone back to add the SAT as a requirement again, and of course the ACT as well, if they're adding SAT as an option, okay? So you want to make sure that even like if you're early in high school, it makes sense for you to prepare for SAT or ACT because you don't want to rule out certain colleges just because you decided early on that you were going to go test optional, right? So it gives you much more strategic options to go ahead and have like the full range of colleges that you would want to try for. And having a good solid SAT or ACT score was going to be instrumental for that. Okay, so how do you know like what chances you have and like what a good SAT score would be and whether or not to even submit an SAT? Well, oftentimes what we can do is we can take a look at the 75th percentile of the SAT or ACT scores that colleges report, right? So many of these schools will not submit what their average is, right? They will often in their public documents submit like these percentiles, right? 25th percentile means this is the bottom 25th percent or 25% of the people who attended the school will have scores of this or lower, right? The 75th percentile are going to be like, that's the top 25% basically who are attending the school, right? So if you want to be competitive, especially if you're Asian, right? So just because colleges are already kind of like, they've gotten used to the fact that Asians tend to get higher test scores. So these are probably closer to the actual average that you would need. So if you're planning to get to some of these top schools, like a top 20 school, you probably want to shoot for like a 1550 or higher on your SAT or 35 or 36. If you're looking at schools in this like slightly lower tier than that, so top 16 to 30, let's just say, you're looking at maybe at least a 1500, maybe at least a 33 on the ACT. Okay. Even some of these schools that are in like the top 60 or top 70, you still want pretty solid scores, like a 30 at least on the ACT or at least a 1400 on the ACT or SAT, sorry. All right, so the bar is really high still. And in fact, it's probably going to get even higher in the long run because the longer these schools remain test optional, the more people don't submit those lower scores. So which means if you are planning to submit an SAT or ACT, over time, these scores will continue to go even higher, right? So prepare sooner, right? So even if you're like a 9th grader, you should probably be looking to prepare for the SAT or ACT even this early, okay? So what does that mean then? Well, HS2 can help you by Doing score analyses, right? We help our students determine what format is best suited for them. Should they take SAT or should they take ACT? When should you start preparing? So for some people, it depends largely on things like your math level, right? Because SAT or ACT, you need to take at least Algebra 2 or Trig, right? So if you are already in Algebra 2 Trig freshman year, yeah, you can even take the SAT as early as 9th grade if you feel like your English scores are going to be pretty strong already. But in some cases, we might have students wait a little bit more, especially if, let's say, for example, they might be good at math, but they need to strengthen their English ability and their reading ability even more. Okay, so every single summer, HS2 offers a whole range of SAT and ACT classes for all score ranges to help students maximize their results. Okay. We also make sure that students go ahead and get tailored feedback, right? So every single summer, the students will take diagnostic tests, and then we'll have review sessions to make sure that students get feedback in terms of how to improve. All right, what about your major, right? So let's say, for example, you're doing really well for both those two previous categories, right? You have already taken the SAT or ACT and your GPA is pretty good. What else can you do, right? So one of the things we do is like help students determine like, so what's your major going to be, right? So HS2 uses a test called the Highlands Abilities Test in order to help our students determine what's the right major for you, right? So this test is something that tests your innate natural abilities so that we can help find a good match for possible careers and or majors, right? So it's definitely a lot more complex than, let's say, for example, a lot of those personality tests you find online, right? Because many online tests that say like, oh, help you choose your major, it's really just a variant of some common test called a Myers-Briggs personality test. Right. So this one is actually much more detailed, much more sophisticated. In fact, even Fortune 500 companies use this test in order to evaluate people that work in their upper management, right, in order to determine which divisions they're best suited for. Okay. Now, HS2 counselors also help students recommend certain clubs or activities during the summer to help them determine what's that right major, right? You know, what fields are you best suited for? Okay. And so a summer program could be good for this if, let's say, for example, like you're still younger, like 8th grade, 9th grade, and you still haven't quite determined what you want to do. The summer can be an optimal time for you to discover which of those fields are you going to be best suited for. Okay. All right, so one possible choice that you can maybe determine during the summer is whether or not you need something called a strategy major, okay? So for some students, you can pick a major that isn't necessarily what you're gonna end up doing in college, but you're just choosing this so you're gonna be going head-to-head with less competitive students, right? So in the past, fields like computer science or engineering, you can maybe go for a less commonly applied to major like math, or like data science, for example. However, these days, that's getting a little harder as more and more colleges institute what are called direct admit programs, right? So like certain colleges, for instance, if you didn't apply to, let's say, computer science is your major, it's going to be a lot harder for you to transfer into that major, or in some cases, even impossible for you to transfer into that major eventually, right? So you do want to do some research to try to see if maybe there's a better option or whether you need to apply for those majors outright, okay? So one of the things we advise students on is whether or not you can do things in the summer to show evidence for both the strategy major and possibly the main major that you're actually thinking of down the line. Okay, so it really all depends on each individual case, right? So we try to figure out what's best for them in order to determine which majors you're going to be going for when you finally apply for college in the fall of your senior year. Okay, so how can the summer then help you build evidence? Okay, so one of the ways that you can do this is by participating in summer activities, right? So typically most colleges or most high schools, won't have a really broad range of like courses, right? So if you wanted to go in some unique fields, like if you wanted to study cognitive science, or if you wanted to go for aerospace engineering, right? Almost all high schools wouldn't have classes like that, right? So they're just going to have like the standard core classes. So if you have an interest in a field that's much more unique, much more interdisciplinary, it makes sense for you to kind of pursue activities during the summer in order to show that these fields are something that you're truly passionate about, that you have some sort of base experiences in that would show that you're actually going to be a strong student for those fields. Okay. If you just wanted to maybe round out your profile even more, the summer would be a great time for this as well. So if you wanted to add a new activity, because there's not a lot of options for clubs or activities in your high school, you can pursue other hobbies or activities, like you could do a research project. You can add like maybe a less than common sport, like if you want to do rock climbing or archery, for example, you can totally do that during the summer, okay? Of course, if you're already a very high achieving student, right? So doing some research in a STEM field would obviously be an optimal idea for the summer. There are also very ultra competitive summer programs that I'll talk about in a little bit here, where it's already incredibly selective, right? So there's some summer programs that are so selective that they almost have, or in some cases have pretty much the same acceptance rates as like top Ivy League schools, okay? If you're a younger student, if let's say, for example, you're 7th or 8th or 9th grade, you can use the summer to explore various fields. For instance, there are shorter summer programs like EPIC in Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, where you can explore engineering subfields to try to see whether or not you might be best suited for like mechanical engineering or aerospace engineering or computer science, for instance, right? So there are programs like that that are really good for students to sort of figure out what exactly they want to focus on, okay? So here's a range of some of the most competitive summer programs if you just wanted to get sampling of it. By no means are these the only ones out there, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of a sense in terms of which ones are considered some of the most competitive. So if you're a STEM student, probably like the holy grail of summer programs would be RSI. Now, unfortunately, the deadline for this already passed. That's how competitive it is, right? So this one's an MIT, and this typically will have something like a 2, possibly a 3% acceptance rate. So it's even more selective than actual MIT, believe it or not. Right. So, and it's largely because they can't really accept that many students. There's limited space. Okay. So if you're interested in pre-med, Stanford has a program that has a similar acceptance rate to this. It's called SIMMER, right? It's Stanford Institutes of Medical Research. So these two are actually, I think they're 6 or 8 week summer programs, and they are so competitive because they're also free, right? Its cost is basically covered by both MIT and Stanford, right? So if you're thinking of going to business, some summer programs that are most notable for this, there's a program called LaunchX, and the deadline for this hasn't passed yet, right? There's also a program called Leadership in the Business World, which is in Wharton, which of course, if you're going for business, UPenn's Wharton School of Business is widely considered the top business program in the country. So of course, the LBW program is going to be a very, very solid program, right? So I think I saw somewhere that like people who attended LBW who applied to Wharton later on, it was something like a 30% acceptance rate. Okay, so there's a high correlation of people going into Wharton if they attended this summer program, because this summer program is already highly, highly selective, right? There is also, for humanities students, there's the Stanford Humanities Institute, which is pretty selective. It's not quite as selective as these top ones that I just showed you earlier. The hardest one to get into for humanities is the Telluride Association summer program, right? So Telluride Association is probably something like a 4 or 5% acceptance rate. So that is going to be also very fiercely competitive. Okay, so this is just a sampling. By no means are you thinking that if you didn't get into one of these that it's not worthwhile, because there's a whole range of these. This is really just the cream of the crop. These are the hardest to get into ones, okay? So oftentimes, we help our students craft a list. So if you want to shoot for these top ones, you have access to it. If you wanted to go for ones that are maybe a little bit more sort of attainable, I think at the end of the day, right, while it's great to be able to get one of these programs, as long as you have something that is rigorous, right? So that's probably the most important thing, that you can get access to maybe a research or an internship summer program. That would probably be one of the hardest ones to get into, right? All right, next is how can you be competitive for these programs? Well, I already showed you that these things are very, very hard to get into. So what you can do is you can view these as kind of like a 2 or 3 step process, right? So almost all of those top programs that we just showed earlier, they will have a strong preference for rising seniors. So what can you do if you're a younger student? Well, you could use the summer before that, or even the first summer before that, like, after 9th grade, to build resume skills, right? So even if you took like 1 or 2 summers of like taking college level classes and or doing easier to get into summer programs, it'll pave the way for you to be able to get into those top summer programs. Because honestly, a program like RSI, it's almost impossible to get into that if you hadn't already done some prior research in the past summer. Okay, so you have to think of them as kind of like steps along the way in order for you to get into much more competitive summer programs. Okay, and those top programs are almost inaccessible if you didn't actually do something pretty rigorous. Okay, so try to do things that will build your skill sets, right? So like if you want to take like a course or two to get to learn some data science or some programming skills, I think that would be good if your end goal is to get into a very high level STEM-based summer program. Okay, next. You can also go ahead and set up internships, right? So these are a little harder to get into though, but there are some summer programs that do match you specifically with college level professors. But I would caution any of you who are thinking of, oh, I just know like a family friend, or there's this professor who says that they can just, put my name down or anything, just because colleges are now looking more and more for evidence of what it is that you've done. Okay. So a lot of colleges like MIT, for example, will have like research portfolios where you're supposed to submit evidence of what it is that you've done, right? So if what you've done was only on paper and you didn't actually do a real internship, colleges will know pretty quickly, right? And so the most competitive internships are ones that you're actually doing things with like, legitimate organizations and or actual colleges, right? So in the past, HS2, for instance, has set up internships with institutions like George Mason University or UC Riverside, where they're actually done with college professors and they're high-level internships where there's there's actually like capstone projects that the students do that'll show that they're building up skills and getting stronger in research. Okay. All right. Lastly, you can use the summer to make your profile look more complete or well-rounded. Okay. So what does this mean? Right. So like for certain activities, for example, you can use the summer to go ahead and get more competitive for those activities. So if you're participating in things like that are competitive in nature, like DECA, robotics, even journalism or speech and debate, you could use the summer to go ahead and do camps to help hone your skills to make yourself much more competitive. Right. If it's something you've never done before, summer is actually also a good time to try a new activity that you can maybe do during the school year, especially if your school, say, for example, doesn't have a club for a certain activity that you wanted to do. Engaging in that in the summer can actually help you in order to maybe help convince your school that you do need to have this club or activity. Okay. All right. Volunteering is also something that is fairly useful for you to do in the summer because for many students, you don't have that much time during the school year, right? Your schedule is so busy. Maybe your parents can't like spare the time to drive you to these places to do some volunteering. But if you spent the summer doing things related to kind of like, doing things to help out your community or your school, that's another great way for you to use the summer to help, strengthen your overall profile. Okay. One of the things that we are able to do at HS2 is we have our own nonprofit wing called Compassionate Scholars. So if you thought it was really intimidating for the idea to kind of like maybe do something for volunteering, you didn't want to start your own nonprofit organization, you can build one directly through HS2 Academy, right? So we have an umbrella nonprofit that'll help students be able to create their own nonprofit projects without the trouble or the hassle of filing for their own 501c3, which is what you would need to have like a legal nonprofit. Okay. All right. So with all this said and done, like how can HS2 Academy help you stand out even more? Well, one of the things we do at HS2 is we have a long track record of continued success helping guide students to get the best possible results. Okay, so this year we've already had some really impressive results getting students into places like Oxford, MIT. We have a couple of students who've already gotten to Stanford, right? But over the years, we're just as proud, of course, of students getting into their dream schools, even if it's not necessarily one of these top caliber schools. What we really pride ourselves on is really maximizing your potential for success. So no matter where you are in the scale, right? So let's say, for example, you're even having trouble right now with your classes, right? Even if you're not shooting for like a top 20 school, we're just as proud of the students who are able to get into like a really, really solid school for their major, as much as we're proud of students who are able to get into these top Ivy League type schools, okay? All right. Another thing that we do is we always find ways for our students to have like access to even better activities. Let's say, for example, your club or your school doesn't have something related to business or entrepreneurship. HS2 offers programs like Project Echo, for instance, right? So last spring, we had students participate in this business plan competition where we had people within our company mentor students in order to help them produce better ideas for like a business pitch, right? And so one of our teams actually won the Social Entrepreneurship Award, right? So they were the top team in the nation out of a field of like over 100 different people competing nationwide. They won first place for their category, okay? So, we do try to have our students, like find opportunities like this to excel, especially if their high schools don't necessarily have activities such as this, okay? So that's another way we help our students like stand out even more, okay? Every single summer, of course, like we said earlier, for like things like your classes, things like standardized testing, we will offer those to our students. We have online classes. In some of our larger offices, we will also have in-person classes to really help our students prepare for the upcoming school year, okay? So overall, just wanted to also say, Compassionate Scholars is that like nonprofit wing that we had earlier that I was telling you about. And every single year we have new projects that students can join, or they can actually create on their own as well, right? So we've had very successful programs like we raised money for the American Cancer Society. But our students really amaze us in terms of their creativity every single year, right? So, they have causes they're really passionate about, and they can create programs like if you're really into animals, for instance, we have the Toys for Paws initiative. If, let's say, for example, you're into like mental health and wellness, for example, one of our other students created a club specifically get students involved in programs relating to mental health, right? So whatever your passions are, HS2 can help you find creative ways in order to be able to make an impact in your school, within your community as well. All right, so with that, I kind of want to open it up for Q&A. So I'll probably